said that quarterback Jalen Hurts and head coach Nick Sirianni at no point last year was it a healthy relationship. And when they're together one-on-one, it doesn't work at all. It doesn't work at all. It works a little better when you have somebody who is a buffer between the young quarterback and the young coach. And this is key, because this is what my sources told me when he got the job. I didn't think it was going to work. A source described a lack of respect for Sirianni's X's and O's, and that's important. So I made 2 phone calls when Nick Sirianni got hired. They both said the same thing. He's not ready. He doesn't have an expertise on either side of the ball yet. You could criticize Lincoln Riley at USC. He knows offense. You can criticize, Kirby Smart, first year at Georgia, but the defense immediately got better. Immediately. The great coaches, even the really good ones, Matt Eberflus in Chicago, he got the defense figured out. Last 10 weeks of the year, Chicago was the best defense in the league. And that's in a division with a lot of good offensive coaches, right? So Sirianni doesn't have an expertise. And so people aren't buying it. There was also something that I pointed out, and people love to push back, but I knew I was right. Remember his opening press conference? It was a disaster. He was just word salad. He was nervous. It does matter. Sean McVay and D'Amico Ryan's opening press conferences. Sharp, a plan, and precise. That's how their teams play. Sirianni, the words didn't match the sentences, didn't match. It was just throw croutons and anchovies in that thing. It was word salad. It was a mess. Now, people will say, well, Dan Campbell's opening press conference, no, it was intense and over the top, but that's what the Lions are. He had a plan. His plan was, we're going to bite kneecaps off. We're going to be intense. We're going to fight to the final whistle. Well, that's what the Lions are. Go back to even when Dan Campbell's opening team, remember the first year or two with Goff, and they weren't winning a bunch? But I can remember coming on this show and saying, God, nobody plays harder than the Lions. They are losing games on the back end because their defense is a sieve. It's awful, but that team plays harder than anybody in the league. So Dan Campbell may have been over the top and biting kneecaps, but he had a plan, and the Lions are winning due to Dan Campbell. The Eagles are winning, it feels like, despite Nick Sirianni. There's a big difference. I talked about this yesterday. Baseball makes moves reacting to problems. Football, the NFL make moves. They make moves proactively while they're on top to tweak and remain on top. Those are 2 different set of changes. That's the difference between somebody like the NFL who's healthy and decides, I want to do an all-plant diet and get even healthier. And baseball's the chain smoker who's told, stop or you'll die in a month. Okay, I'll stop. They're not the same changes. Okay? Don't take all press conferences that are different the same. Sirianni was word salad. He looked overwhelmed. McVay never does. D'Amico Ryan's never does. By the way, Bill Belichick, grumpy press conferences. That's what he is. At some point, that's why nobody wants to hire him. Control freak, tries to control the media. So the only time Sirianni has truly flourished with arguably the best roster in football his entire time there. They've had the best offensive line since he arrived, and he's an offensive coach. They've had unbelievable tight end wide receiver talent. They've been a little sketchy on the back end, but almost every team in the league is. I mean, who's got great corners and safeties? Like Kansas City, and they just had to get rid of a corner. Like almost everybody in the league could use another corner or a great safety. So this is a real thing, is that the players do not respect Sirianni's X's and O's, and that's what sources told me. They're like, you got to be, when you walk into it, you could be a college coach or a pro coach. You got to know one side of the ball. You got to be an expert. You don't have to be an expert on both. I mean, McVay's run through defensive coordinators. Kyle Shanahan's run through defensive coordinators. But the Niners are about that offense and the physicality of it. And the Rams are about that offense and the precision of it. And so this is a real thing. Those opening press conferences, they're a glimpse. I say this. You go to Wednesday press conferences for quarterbacks. They don't say everything. Nothing is everything, but everything's something. And this story does not surprise me. They don't respect his X's and O's. He's like strangely difficult to get along with, sometimes juvenile, barking at fans, refs. So there you go.
Okay, I want to talk about this because I agree with a lot of what Colin is saying. And it is a problem with Philly, having Sirianni. I can't really say his name because I'm going to have to call him Nick because my phone goes off when I say his last name. But it is the problem when you don't really have a true expertise on one side of the ball, defense or offense. When you are the true mastermind, the one who is putting their philosophy down, who is the true leader, who is creating that identity, whether it's defense or offense, it matters so much. It matters so much, and that's what Colin was highlighting. And when you're this other coach who doesn't really have this true expertise, and you are really at the mercy of your coordinators, it puts you in a weaker position. And it is now where you're just like, if you are a player, you recognize that he's the head coach, but also like, I got to go talk to my position coach, right? I got to go talk to my coordinator. Like, he's the one that is actually directing this. He's the one that's actually making the correct decisions here. And when things are going well, it's a lot easier to kind of just like keep on keeping on, right? Like you're like able to just kind of keep up with that flow. But once you hit some resistance and have some issues, that's when these things kind of start to explode. And that's what we're seeing. It was okay before when the Eagles were winning and they went to the Super Bowl. It's all good. They also had two very, very, very strong individual coordinators on offense and defense. Two coordinators that are essentially to their core head coaches as well, right? And as they actually became head coaches. So having them part of the staff really allows that now to Sirianni kind of to not be that expert, to kind of just be the guy who's kind of, pulling some of these strings and letting all of the actual nitty gritty, the actual details be managed by two obviously extremely competent, buttoned up, hyper intelligent coordinators. And now that allows Sirianni to kind of to not have that pressure. He doesn't. It's not coming down on him to figure it all out. And now that those coordinators are gone, we saw what happened last season. And so it is a legitimate issue. It really, really is. And I was actually thinking that the Eagles should have let go of him. And they should have went out and tried to get a Ben Johnson, even a Bill Belichick. They should have done something besides keep him. I wasn't a fan of the hire in the first place. And I was like, oh, he's not that good. And then when they went to the Super Bowl, I was still like, I'm not super sold on him. And like, I look dumb saying those comments. And I didn't have a channel at the time, but it's just conversations I was having with friends and family. And they're like, oh, you said he's not a good coach and they're going to the Super Bowl. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. But, there's just because you're having success doesn't mean that you're actually successful. Doesn't mean that you're actually good. There's a difference. And so I'm personally not a fan of him. Even if they completely turn this around and win a Super Bowl, I still think you're at the mercy of your coordinators. I really do. And I think that's a fundamental issue. And if you're not an expert on either side of the ball, then you better get along with the players. The players better love you. And that's where I am a little confused, because it does seem like the players, for the most part, do really like him. But did they really like him when they were winning? It's easy to get along when you're winning. When you're losing, not so much. So it's just that the Eagles are in this tough situation. The only thing that you can really trust as an Eagles fan is that you can trust that Philly will make the right decision ultimately, because they historically have. They have great ownership, great front office. They make the right decisions more often than not. And I think they made major strides this offseason to be better, to be a better team. And I think they will be a top team in the NFL. But the only thing is does this kind of kick the can down the road a little bit longer for Nick S. That ends up being kind of the interesting dilemma that they're in. I personally think he's gone if there's anything shy of a Super Bowl appearance. And unless it's a very close competitive Super Bowl, and they either, of course, if they win, they'll keep him. But if they lose by 3, or it's another kind of heartbreaker, I think they could probably keep him. But if they if they make it to the Super Bowl and they lose kind of convincingly, I think he's gone. And I think if he just, if he makes it to the NFC Championship game and loses, wild card, whatever, I think it's truly like you better come home with a ring, and if not, it better be an absolute heartbreaker where Patrick Mahomes was just truly the GOAT in that moment. Anything shy of that, you're gone. That's what I personally believe, especially if we're talking about some of these other potential coaches out there. I think the Eagles could have made a play for Harbaugh. I think there was legitimate moves for them to make, and they just didn't. But I will say this, and I want to emphasize this. Nick and Jalen's relationship does not actually matter to me at this point, because he's not the mastermind. If the Eagles head coach Nick was the actual mastermind of the offense, and he was the true X's and O's and the true detail-oriented guy, then the relationship with Hurts would actually matter tremendously more. They would have to have a highly collaborative relationship. But since he's not, since that all goes through the coordinator, right? Whether it was going to be a Shane Steichen or now Kellen Moore, it doesn't really matter. Very similar to how Tom Brady and Bill Belichick never got along in all the years. Never got dinner together, never did anything together. They didn't need to get along. They did not need to get along. They only had their one main meeting a week or whatever. And then outside of that, Tom Brady was running the offense through coordinating, through his coordinators, right? It was just a completely separate division, essentially, right? If this was a business, it was a completely different building, different division, different, staff, different bosses, different everything, different email accounts. So it doesn't really matter. That's the interesting thing about football. Football is so much more of a business, the way how it's run and operated, and how everything gets so broken down into these small things. You guys see it on Hard Knocks. If you didn't play football, you at least can watch this on Hard Knocks. You can see how everything gets broken down into their tiny little small groups. This isn't similar to, say, basketball or baseball even. So the relationship between Jalen and Nick only needs to be so good, actually, for them to have success. They could hate each other. And yet, as long as Jalen, if Kellen Moore is a great OC and him and Jalen get along, then it doesn't matter. Again, we've seen this a lot over the years. Especially over the years, back when defense was a little bit more a focal point in football, where you had a lot more defensive head coaches. You had plenty of these hard-nosed, really jerky, old-school defensive head coaches that had nothing to do with the offense, and they didn't get along with their quarterback, or they had these weird relationships, and yet the quarterback was still able to thrive and be great. And I'm sure people have played for those teams. Now, listen, I have been on plenty of teams where I had a coach who clearly was not it. He clearly was not it. And it was a problem. You would rely on the assistants to be like, God, this guy, what is he doing? What is he doing? Who is this guy? And you can feel it and you can sense it. And the players know. You definitely cannot trick the players. The players know. I've had coaches who I really liked, who I thought were awesome, but they clearly did not know. I've had that at many different levels. And it can be a problem if you're relying on them, especially if you're relying on them to make key decisions. And it can be very frustrating. And that's why it feels so good, especially as a player, when you really are with truly competent, great coaches, because you feel it. You feel protected. You feel that trust. More than anything, you just have that trust that when they tell you something, you don't have to filter it. You sometimes have coaches who you don't have to filter anything, and you can just unconditionally listen and trust and absorb everything that they have to say, whether it's through practice, whether it's in the middle of the game, whether it's after the game, whenever. And then you have other coaches where everything they say, it's just a filter after filter after filter. A lot of, there's got to be a lot of jumping through hoops to kind of like figure out like, what is this guy saying? Is he actually right? Is there even worth listening to? Because sometimes those coaches that don't really know what they're doing and you don't have that trust, they can actually be dangerous because they can cause a lot of harm. Because they'll say certain things where you'll be like, wait, what is that? Is that right? Wait, it just starts to like kind of undermine you a little bit. And that's where kind of Sirianni potentially is kind of coming from, which makes it a little problematic. But I think as long as they have the strong individual coordinators, you can get away with it. You can win, as we saw them get to a Super Bowl and almost win the Super Bowl. So I think to really sum it all up, I do think that the Eagles can absolutely be successful this season. I think they will be successful this season, but this is also a thing that the Eagles are currently dealing with. And if you're an Eagles fan, I wouldn't just completely just cast this aside as just nonsense and doesn't matter. Because I can see a lot of Eagles fans being like, this is not real. This is whatever. This is nonsense. No, 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 no. You can still be an Eagles fan. You can still believe that the Eagles are going to be great. And you can still be like, yeah, Nick may not be the guy. But those are just my thoughts. I would absolutely love to hear yours. What do you guys all think? Do you think Jalen and Nick like need to mend their relationship? Do you think this is like a short-term problem or a long-term problem? Or do you think it really won't matter as much? Or do you think the story as a whole is just kind of nonsense? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single comment, so whether you agree with me or disagree with me, either way, let's get in some discussions, let's get in some fights, but ultimately, let's just have some fun. And please do consider subscribing. We are building an amazing community here, and I would absolutely love to see you part of it. I want to build something that we all genuinely feel connected to, something that we're really excited to be part of. I think we're well on our way to doing it. And please don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, as it really does help with the visibility and the algorithm. Thank you so much, and see you next time.